Assalamu alaikum guys, this is Ahmed Mawar aka Mr. Middle Path, and this is a quick introduction into what we're going to be covering throughout these three-part series on weed use throughout Muslim history and the distinction between Muslim history and Islamic history. Islamic history being the history that we take that is sacred, that Muslims can form religious rulings out of and use those events to make a legal interpretation out of that. Such events would obviously be the life of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It also includes, but is not limited to, the founding generations, most of what they did and much of what the actions that they made and that they said. Most Muslims, almost all Muslims, would consider that as sacred, and you can extract religious rulings from that. There are other events as well that Muslims would consider as part of Islamic history, and Islamic history and Muslim history overlap. It's not like, bang, this is Islamic history, bang, that's Muslim history. No, they overlap with each other. Muslim history, though, would be things that, for better or for worse, the actions of Muslim people, for better or for worse, that is just, it's not sacred. You're not going to take a religious ruling out of it, even if it's for the better. And if it's for the worse, then, that's still irrelevant. That's still Muslim history. Now, that being said, that's why I chose the name weed use throughout Muslim history, because I didn't want people to think that, oh, it's okay to smoke weed in Islam, or like some other, I don't know what people think about when they watch these videos. So that's why it was very important for me to put this intro out. And part one will talk about a general overview of the history that the Muslim Ummah went through. When exactly in this history did weed use start to become known, and in what form was it consumed in, and how did the doctors use it? Because at first it was introduced as a medicine, and this was introduced 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So again, how the scholars looked at it, because this was something new that they didn't have access to before, so they didn't know how to put a ruling on it, and what decisions they made to make the ruling on it. Nowadays, obviously, all scholars think that weed use is forbidden. How did the scholars view it in the past is something that will be looked at a little bit in part one, but mainly in part two. Part two will also go into more about what the scientists viewed it as, and then we'll cover in part one and part two. Part one will cover mainly the general history, but part two will also cover how the poor people viewed it, and also how some poets viewed it and what they wrote about it as well. Part three will go into a more interesting section where how the rulers and the warrior classes viewed it and the soldiers viewed it and what they did. So an example would be a king that thought that weed use was hurting the effectiveness of his troops. I mentioned who that was and what his accomplishments were and the edicts that he made and what the effects were. And then we try and move up all the way till present day. In present day, obviously, weed use is still a problem in Muslim societies and in non-Muslim societies as well. And the conversations that people were having about weed today are very similar to the conversations that were happening back then. And we're going to go into more depth and more detail in that, inshallah, right now. Without further ado, let us begin. Assalamu alaikum guys. So this is the history of weed and hashish use in Muslim history. And the reason I chose the name Muslim history instead of Islamic history, because Islamic history sounds like it's the history of the religion, right? As in it's a sacred thing. Whereas I chose the name Muslim history because it's the history of people, Muslim people, and we can analyze it and we can look at it and we can see what happened. So when did hash use start in? And before I talk about weed and hashish is an extract of weed, and that is what they used to use. Nobody smoked weed, right? It was only later on when the European colonists started using tobacco and cigarettes and rolling cigarettes that people started to smoke weed. But in the past, even before Islam, even before the Muslim history began, like thousands of years ago, people were eating it, right? They would use it as potions, or they would eat it in India and in other places, right? So eating hash, right, or eating hashish extracts, or turning it into a liquid form and eating it, that's just how it was consumed. During the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it was unknown amongst the Arabs, right? And after Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed away, the four righteous Khulafa, they started expansion. And when Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was killed, that marked the end of the four Khulafa Rashidin. radiyallahu anhum, and then you started the Umayyad dynasty, as in king, and then the son of the king would become the next king, which was not Islamic the way that that succession worked, but it happened, right? And they continued expanding. After the Umayyad dynasty was the Abbasid dynasty, and the Umayyad dynasty didn't last that long, right? So after that was the first Umayyad dynasty didn't last that long. There was a second Umayyad dynasty in Spain, but I'm getting ahead of myself right now. So for the first 200 years of Muslim history, when the expansions were going en masse, weed was unknown. After weed became introduced in Muslim history, and I'm not going to say that weed was the reason that Muslim people stopped expanding. It was clearly a lot of other factors, right? But after around 200 years, during the Abbasid dynasty, when the seat of power shifted from Central Arabia, then to Syria, and then to Baghdad, right, into Iraq, and weed use started to become known, right? Hash use started to become known, and it was known as the grass of the poor, right? And in some poets would call it Haydar's wine or Haydar's elixir, because the story goes, and it may not be a true story, but Haydar was a Muslim, like Sufi sect. And he did not invent hash use, obviously, but what it said is that he sort of invented a way to make a potion out of weed or out of hash, and he would drink that, and he would tell his followers to drink that. It was called Haydari Tariqa, right? And it doesn't, I've never heard of Haydari Tariqa. I don't think that exists anymore. The story may or may not be true, but culturally it was referred to as the grass of the poor, grass, Haydar's cup, Haydar's wine, Haydar's elixir. It was also referred to as keef. Have you ever heard of keef? If some of you guys are in the smoking world or you are familiar with it, there's keef, which is the extract of the THC, and you heat it up and it turns into a kind of like a little brown paste. That was from the Arabic word kaif, which was the description of the mental high that someone would get. So going back to the Abbasid dynasty, they lasted for a while before they got crushed by the Mongols, right? Literally got crushed by the Mongols. And the Ayyubid dynasty, which was Salah ad-Din. So you had the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Fatimid dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty, the Mamluk dynasty, and then the Ottomans, okay? And the Umayyad dynasty fell to the Abbasid dynasty, but one of the people from the Umayyad dynasty, whose name was Abdurrahman al-Dakhil, ran away from the Abbasids and went to Spain and re-established the Umayyad dynasty in Spain. But for the purposes of this video, the Umayyad dynasty was done for, because the Umayyad dynasty was way more than Spain. They had the whole Muslim world under their grasp. But after that happened, it split up into the Abbasid dynasty, the Fatimid dynasty in the middle around the Egypt area, and then the Umayyad dynasty towards Spain, right? The three separate areas. Anyways, the Mongols came. Fatimid dynasty fell to the Ayyubid dynasty. Who's the Ayyubid dynasty? Salah ad-Din, or Saladin in Western history, called Saladin, who made the agreement with Richard the Lionheart and is famous for taking back the Palestine. Although, the history, I don't want to get into that. This history is not about the history of the Crusades or Muslim conquest. It's about the history of weed use in Islamic history, okay? In Muslim history, sorry. It's almost like imprinted in our brains that this is Islamic history, when really it's the history of people, right? The history of Muslim people. So anyways, Ayyubid dynasty, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi was his last name. Saladin al-Ayyubi. He founded the Ayyubid dynasty, removed the Fatimids from power, right? And there you go. Anyways, the Ayyubid dynasty fell to the Mamluks, right? And then the Mamluks took over the Abbasid dynasty. They were a power, and then it was the Ottomans, right? So Crusades was around 800 years ago, a little bit more, in the 1200s. No, not the 1200s. Sorry, 1,000 years ago. Sorry, 1,000 years ago. It was around 1099 AD was the Crusades. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's revelation, 610 AD, around that time. Okay, so we have about 1400 to 1400 years of Muslim history, or in the beginning we'll call it Islamic history, because that's Prophet Muhammad ﷺ representing Islam and the Khulafa representing Islam. going back in time now to 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu when the Umayyad dynasty fell and the Abbasids were in power, right? Abbasids were in power. They did the same thing as the Umayyads. Father dies, the son takes the throne, or one of the family members takes the throne. Anyways, so around this time, scholars were arguing about what do we do with weed? Do we make it halal or do we make it haram? Because in the Quran it says that khamr means general intoxicant is haram. Common people thought that khamr just meant alcohol. Oh, and you hear the same thing from Muslims today, who think that weed is okay. Oh, it only says alcohol is haram in the Quran. It doesn't say anything about weed. But khamr means specifically alcohol. Generally, it means an intoxicant. So anything that intoxicates would be considered haram. But what threw these scholars off was that doctors at the time, many different doctors, were prescribing hash as a medicine, right? So baldness, prescribe you hash because hash lowers your testosterone. So I'm going to talk about all of this in another segment when we go over this recent scientific studies, right? But back then they didn't have scientific studies. It was just observation. We're just going to see what happens with people who smoke too much weed, or eat too much weed, right? And these guys were getting real high. They were getting real high because when you smoke weed, scientifically, it takes you a minute to 5 minutes to get smacked, to get really high. And the high goes away after 3.5 hours, right? And in some cases, more if it's really potent, but no more than 4 hours. 3 to 3.5 hours is around the maximum time where it gets your body gets rid of it. I'm going to talk about that in the scientific section, okay? So they would eat it, and when you eat it, the THC, which is the psychoactive compound, right, gets metabolized by your liver. And when it gets metabolized in your liver, it lasts in your system for 8 hours before your body gets rid of it. It takes you around half an hour to 2 hours to get high by eating it, but you stay high for 8 hours. So these guys were getting real high, and in some cases, if they had the time and the ability to, they would turn it into a potion, like a really extract potion of high concentrated stuff. So these guys were getting really high. So the doctors would sometimes prescribe hash as a medicine, right? And when it came to this medicine, this is what threw the Muslim scholars off, right? It's like, okay, it's used as a medicine, but it's also used as an intoxicant. So do we say it's haram or do we say it's halal? This was the conversation that was taking place almost 1,200 years ago, 1,300 years ago, right? And they ultimately decided that it's completely forbidden unless it is for a genuine medical purpose. And some of the medical purposes, like I said, the baldness. I talked. There's other things such as appetite. They had different illnesses that they would use it for, right? And they also remarked on the side effects, and I'm going to talk about the side effects in a little bit in part 2 of the video. So stay tuned. We're going to talk more about weed use in Islamic history, Muslim history. God, I keep making that mistake.